Okay, so without further ado, Christopher.
Thank you, sir. Welcome. The only meeting in this referendum campaign which we anyone talking any sense. Now, there are two things in my life that I've always very carefully tried to avoid. One is climbing Everest, which I've so far succeeded in doing. The other is chairing a meeting. And I've managed to get away with it for 78 years without doing it. But I've been forced into it by my old friend and colleague, Mr. Dr. North. Because I'm here to sort of introduce him as well and say a few words, he said. And secondly, because, as some of you will know, he needs someone to keep him in order, and that's part of my role. I thought, but since I'm not a chairman, I'm just an introducer, it's going to be the you lot who keep him in order. If you feel like heckling, please do. And you'll have a chance to make your questions later. The first thing, I wanted to set the tone of this meeting by borrowing a practice from old-time vicars who, when they were going to preach a sermon, liked to start with a holy text. Now, you'll be pleased to hear my holy text is not from the Bible. It is from Margaret Thatcher, which some people might think was the next best thing. So I'm going to have to read this because I must get her words absolutely right. This is what she wrote in her last book in 2003. That such an unnecessary and irrational project as building a European superstate was ever embarked on will seem in future years to be perhaps the greatest folly of the modern era. And that Britain, with her traditional strengths and global destiny, should ever have become part of it, will appear a political error of the first magnitude. Whatever we may think of Mrs. Thatcher, and we've got different views, I know, about a lot of things, she did have one quality which is very rare in politicians. She was very famous, as you remember, for saying, "You turn if you like, but the lady is not for turning." Actually, on certain very important issues, Mrs. Thatcher, as she then was prepared to admit that she'd got something seriously wrong and did a complete U-turn. And one of those subjects was Europe. Some of you may recall that back in 1975, when we last had a referendum in-out referendum on Europe, Mrs. Thatcher, just become leader of the Tory party, was absolutely gung-ho for staying in. And she dutifully intoned the little mantras that she'd inherited from her predecessor as Prime Minister, Edward Heath. But then, in 1979, when she became Prime Minister, she embarked on a long and very uncomfortable learning curve. She had to sit through interminable, utterly tedious, often very fractious meetings of the European Council. She had her 5-year-long battle for the rebate, which was entirely justified because what she was trying to undo is a financial stitch-up, which Heath had allowed us to be let in for when we joined in '73. In 1985 and 86, she was hideously tricked, as she finally realized, over the single market, or the Single European Act, I should say, the next treaty. In 1988, she had gone a very long way, so far that she went off to Bruges, you'll remember, and made her famous speech, which shocked all the audience of European dignitaries in front of her, warning that Europe was heading to become what she called, perhaps not totally accurately, what she called a superstate. But it was a very powerful speech. In 1989, she was disastrously blackmailed by her two most senior ministers into taking Britain into the exchange rate mechanism, which she knew would end in tears. And in 1990, it had become obvious to the European establishment that, armed with a veto which she would have been prepared to use, she was the one remaining huge obstacle to the treaty they were planning at Maastricht, which would set up the European Union with its own single currency and very much more. And at that point, as we described in The Great Deception in some detail, the Europhiles, both in Westminster and in Brussels, ganged up just after she said no, no, no to Mr. Delors with his plans to create an even grander form of government in Brussels. They ganged up and got rid of her. Now, the point about this, why I've told that little recap that story, much of which, of course, will be familiar to you, is that she'd been on this long learning curve, and what she had realized was that everything she'd originally been told about the nature and purpose of the European project was wrong, and often deliberately so. She had actually begun to cotton on to what its real nature and purpose was. And this led her to a conclusion which I was privileged to hear from her directly a year or two later when or 4 years, 6 years later, actually after her fall, I took part in I was invited with my family to a weekend in Scotland with several quite senior Tories, and Mrs. Thatcher and her husband were the star guests. And there were a couple of bright young teenagers in the party, one of whom was my son Nick, who had been the youngest speaker at the Referendum Party conference in Brighton a few months earlier. And Mrs. Thatcher said, or she was by then Lady Thatcher, I must be accurate. She said, tonight I want you all to come into the library and these young people can ask me questions about anything they like. So the first speaker was, or the first questioner was a young lad who was the son of a former cabinet minister, who, being the son of a former cabinet minister, asked a very dutiful and boring question, which she replied to dutifully and very boringly and quite short. Then my dear son Nick put up his hand and said, Lady Thatcher, do you think we should leave the European Union? And her eyes lit up. And she held up, how can I do this? I can't multitask. She held up the fingers of her left hand and she said at once, very emphatically, there are 5 reasons why Britain should leave the European Union. And then she spoke very passionately, very coherently, for 25 minutes, without stopping, but just ticking off the reasons why we should leave the European Union by her fingers. And then she stopped, at which point my son raised his hand again and said, Lady Thatcher, you said there were 5 reasons why we should leave the European Union. You've only told us 4. And she paused for a second. And then her eyes lit up again and she said, they stole our fish. So no one present in that room that night could have had any doubt as to what Mrs. T thought. Now, she wasn't very public about it, as we know. She was discreet, but she did, some years later, in that book I quoted from just now, write that amazingly powerful statement, which I used as my text. Now, when Richard North and I began researching for our book, The Great Deception, one of the things which particularly struck us was, as we went through, and particularly I have to say Richard, because he is a very quick reader, is Richard, much quicker than me, thousands of documents, papers, books, biographies, heaven knows what. One of the things which struck us was about almost everything that had ever been said or written about the history of the European project got the story very seriously wrong. And often, as I say, quite deliberately so. And one of the most important things we discovered was that the core idea which lie behind the European Union in years to come was originally conceived way back in the 1920s by two men, one of them a Frenchman called Jean Monnet. And what these two men had come to conclude was that what was needed for the future of Europe, this is back in the 1920s, was to create a United States of Europe of a very particular kind. They wanted it to be ruled by what they called a supranational government. And this was something that the world had never really seen before, because what it was based on was two principles. One was there should be a central authority which was not answerable to any electorate, that was composed largely of technocrats, if not entirely, which would take away all the powers from the nation states making it up, all the powers that they had to govern themselves. And the second corollary of this was that the two men who were behind this idea back in the 20s never in any sense intended it to be democratic. They knew best. Now, of course, it took another 20-odd years before Monsieur Monnet, who was now very important in France, had the chance to start putting their idea into practice. It was exactly the same idea they'd had 20 years before. Monnet was a brilliant fixer. You have to hand it to him. He was one of the most extraordinary men in the whole of the 20th century. His name is known, I suspect, to most people in this room, but it is not widely known. If you went out to the street and said, do you know who Jean Monnet was, you'd get out of 100 people, probably 99, possibly, unless you talk to a Frenchman, or a Eurocrat, of course, you would not find anyone who knows who he was. But he was more influential than almost anyone else in the 20th century, apart from a few obvious examples like Adolf Hitler and Joe Stalin, or Lenin, rather. So they started to Monnet started to put this into effect in 1950 with that coal and steel community, which you know about. But it was then that he, by this time, had a little group of, closely knit group of politically motivated men who were with him, and they realized that they were not going to get their United States of Europe all at one fell swoop. There was no way that that would be accepted. So the second core idea, which has been so important ever since, was that they realized they should conceal the true nature of their ultimate goal, and that they should build up their government for Europe, bit by bit, over many years. And that, of course, is what we have seen happening ever since. Treaty by treaty, directive by directive, we have seen the supranational government being built up, gradually sucking away the powers of all the national governments. And that, of course, is where we have got to in 2016, because I was just remind myself, there was a thought which occurred to me when I was sketching out what I was going to talk about. Yes, I talked about the idea that they were going to conceal the real purpose and ultimate goal. And of course, that great deception, that was why we called our book The Great Deception, along with many other deceptions along the way. But for a long time, it seemed to work brilliantly well, exactly as the Grand Plan had laid down way back in the early 50s. Bit by bit, treaty by treaty, it was all happening. But we paid an enormous price for this deception. We paid several prices, but one of them, which has become very obvious again recently, is that very few people, because it is all, so much of it has happened in the shadows, so much of it hasn't been properly explained, so much of it hasn't been properly reported, we have now whole generations of politicians, let alone the media and the public at large, who don't really understand what's been going on, don't really understand the way this whole system of government works, and they don't understand what is the real goal, this ever closer union that is so glibly talked about what it's really about and where it is meant to lead to. Now, it is true that a few politicians over the years have understood the real nature and purpose of what's going on both sides of the argument. One of them, of course, was Edward Heath, who, as we discovered even more than we'd known already when we were writing The Great Deception, chapter and verse of, he knew exactly what he was up to in 1961 when we first applied to go in, and even more when he took us in 1973. He knew what the real purpose was, and he went along with The Great Deception. On the other side, we had Hugh Gaitskell. Some of you may be old enough to remember Hugh Gaitskell, who in that amazing speech, which is well worth rereading today in the light of what's happened since, where he led the Labour Party into opposition to the Tory plan to get us into Europe, and warned that it would lead to the most extraordinary disaster politically, the end of 1,000 years of history. And the same broad conclusions and understanding, of course, were reached many years after that by Mrs. later Lady Thatcher. So that's the situation we've reached today, where we have this dismal referendum campaign, where we hear the most amazing rubbish being talked night or written and talked day after day and night after night. And of course, we've moved on a long way since Mrs. Thatcher's downfall in terms of seeing what the nature of this monster that we're all part of is really about. We've seen the ongoing catastrophe of the euro, one of their greatest, boldest, and most crazy experiments. We've seen the hopeless inability of this form of government to deal with the unprecedented tidal wave of migration. And as some of us, perhaps in this room, would understand, we've also seen the utterly disastrous course that we've been launched on with our energy policy, how we keep our lights on, how we keep our economy running, by the infatuation of the European system with climate change, which of course is totally aided and abetted by our own hapless little puppet politicians in Westminster. And here we are, for entirely cynical reasons, we've been given this referendum to decide whether we are to remain part of this, what Mrs. Thatcher described as this, what was it? I must go back to the holy text, get her words exactly right. She said, will seem in future years to be the greatest folly of the modern era. Are we going to stay in this folly, or are we going to escape from it? Now, we, unfortunately, probably in this room, have been very depressed in recent weeks to see the unbelievably low-grade level of the way this so-called debate is being taking place, and all the stuff. You don't need me to remind you of all the Project Fear on both. Both sides are talking the most amazing, superficial stuff. But what comes across more than anything else is the fact that they don't really understand what it is at issue, what the European Union is about, what its rules are. We are just being carried along on a tide of fluff. Now, there is one person, you will not be perhaps surprised to hear me say, one person who does understand this, probably arguably better than anyone else. And he is our main speaker, who I'm about to get up on this platform. Now, Richard has spent some years working literally night and day, trying to unravel the incredible complexities of what would be involved in our extrication from this political folly. And he has come up with all sorts of facts, ideas, proposals, strategies, which are literally over the heads of all the people who are parading across our airwaves on the public stage, trying to tell us, totally failing, what this referendum should be about. Now we have a chance, for once, to listen to that one man in the whole of Britain. No, I don't want to over-egg it, but as you know, Richard is incredibly bright. He's one of the best researchers, political researchers in the business. And you now have the pleasure, I hope, of hearing him speak very intensely for A few minutes, Richard. All yours.